Hello, everyone. This is the Religion Unplugged podcast, your one stop shop for all the best religious news and culture. I'm Joseph Holmes, Religion Unplugged's resident culture critic, and with us today is a very special guest. Roy Schwartz is a noted pop culture historian and speaker whose work often focuses on the intersection of comic books and Jewish culture. He is a board member of the American Jewish Historical Society, a former CNN regular contributor, and has written for New York Daily News, IGN, Literary Hub, Philosophy Now, The Forward, and Jerusalem Post, among others. He is the author of the bestseller Is Superman Circumcised? The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero, which received the 2021 Diagram Prize for the oddest book title in the world, which that I get big kick out of that. Um, his new documentary, Juice, the Jewish Comics Experience, recently won the Religion Communicators Council Award. Roy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Well, it's, all true. It's in your bio and it's really a cool pedigree. I'm excited to talk to you today. I'm a big Superman guy and I'm obviously a big religion guy, and so it's all stuff that's up my alley.
That was great.
So, let's get started. Superman hype is at an all-time high now with the release of the new Superman film. And for most people, they know Superman as an American icon, but far less people are aware of his deep Jewish American roots. You've described Superman's in many ways as fundamentally a Jewish character. So, what do you mean by that for those who don't kind of know the history, and how do those things shape the character we're all familiar with?
So, good question. Superman, first and foremost, is an immigrant metaphor. Uh, and you said people think of him as this all-American, and I say, what is more all-American than being an immigrant or the child of immigrants? Um, when I say Superman is Jewish, I don't mean that in the comics, in canon, Clark Kent secretly wakes up in the morning and lays tefillin and goes to shul. It's not a literal argument. He is canonically Christian, usually a non-practicing Protestant. Different comics are shown it differently. Sometimes Methodist, one time Baptist, but usually Protestant. Non-practicing. He doesn't go to church and to services on Sundays. He's busy being in outer space, saving the planet or whatever. Um, and of course, he's an alien, so that's a whole other can of worms. What would be the catechism on religiosity of aliens, even if they're humanoid? But the Jewish argument is allegorical, it's thematic. Superman was created by two Jewish teenagers, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, one an immigrant, one the child of immigrants. Both of their parents were refugees from Europe, from the pogroms before the Holocaust. Um, they arrived in America, and these two kids created Superman using all kinds of things at their disposal. Popeye was an influence, Tarzan was an influence, science fiction was an influence, but also Jewish culture and characters of legend, including Moses, including Samson, including the Golem of Prague, including a little bit of Hebrew, a little bit of Yiddishkeit. And Superman's alter ego, Clark Kent, is first and foremost based on themselves. It's themselves in fiction. We may look nebbishy, we may fit that Jewish stereotype of these bespectacled, shy, awkward guys, but secretly we have this ethnic pride and power hidden under the suit. So, particularly in the context of the 1930s, that's a very powerful and resonant metaphor.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I mean, again, I think a lot of people know, not everybody knows, but a lot of people know that Superman was created by two Jewish brothers and two Jewish boys, and that was and that's a part of that his history. But I think a lot of people don't as well think about how that really influenced the Superman character. That, like you said, they did base him on all on Jewish heroes. They did also talk about their particular experience, and of course, of being, you know, children of Jewish immigrants and part of that story. And again, my family history, again, I'm not Jewish, but my family history had a similar. You talked about this very American immigrant story that, where they did say, okay, I'm have come from the old country and I'm coming here, and I have the issues of assimilation, of having these two different identities, of people in my family history have, changed their last names because it was like, hey, am I can look mainstream. I'm white. I can look like everyone else, but if I give away my name, if I give away certain things, then I'm going to encounter some bias and discrimination here. And so I definitely was able to see, as I got to know the Superman character a little bit more and the context, oh yeah, this is a very particular kind of immigrant story that is, at the very least, those experiences are shaping it in many ways. But then it's not just, an American immigrant story. It's a very particularly Jewish one. You brought up the kind of the cliches of the Jewish stereotype, as you said, of being, with glasses, a little bit more, mild mannered, as the expression goes. What are some other things that were sort of very kind of particularly Jewish, of the Jewish context of immigrant story of Superman, that kind of made their way into the original story? And you also brought up the context of World War II, which I think is interesting.
Another good question. That was like six in one. I'll try to answer them
You also
intelligently,
can do
succinctly. Yeah,
multiple choice. If
yeah,
I do multiple,
exactly.
you can't just skip one, and I might
I
not
mean,
notice.
a Jewish change doesn't make something Jewish. For example, your name is Joseph. It comes from the Bible. It's Hebraic. It doesn't make you Jewish. And Jewish parentage doesn't make a creation, an art creation, Jewish. White Christmas, Irving Berlin, Israel Beilein, he's Jewish. Doesn't make White Christmas a Jewish song. Although I like to point out there's no Jesus, it celebrates the season. But nonetheless, parentage is not enough. The question is, did they consciously, unconsciously, and in this case, I think the answer is both, borrow from their culture, their heritage, their background to create? Is there anything Jewish in Superman's DNA as a character? That's not exclusive to the Jesus elements that are there, and we're going to talk about them in a minute. It's absolutely there. But it's also very Jewish, and it started out as very Jewish. So yes, it's the immigrant experience which we can all relate to, although not every immigrant to the United States, certainly not in the 1930s, could pass for a WASP. And that was the thing to do. There was no identity politics. There was no pride in your, that wasn't a thing. You put on your fedora and your suit and you assimilated and you change your last name, right? So this Jewish boy from the old country called Kal El, El in Hebrew means God. It's the suffix, the theophoric suffix in the name of all the angels and prophets. Danny, El, Gabriel, Kal El.
Mhm.
Uh, for two Jewish kids, and Siegel especially went to synagogue on a regular basis. His mother was very involved in Jewish life. They both grew up in a Yiddish and Hebrew speaking neighborhood in Glenville. It was a predominantly Jewish neighborhood in Cleveland. The idea to name their creation God in Hebrew and never realizing it seems very unlikely to me. So, conscious or unconscious, it's there nonetheless, right? That's not a prerequisite. So there's definitely that kind of, the Jewish kid comes over from the old world, the old country, with the Hebraic name Kal-El, gives himself the name Clark Kent, which sounds like, I say it's the name equivalent of Wonder Bread. It's so white, and right, puts on the fedora, and he assimilates. But underneath, he has his costume. And what is his costume made of? His outfit. In traditional canon, it's the fabrics that his mother wrapped him in when she put him in the rocket ship. That's his ethnic garb. That's his ethnic fabrics. That's his dashiki. That's his talit, right? And it's always there under his clothes. And when he transforms from Clark Kent to Superman and back again, it's not just the personal, it's also the racial. He goes from Earth, from human to Kryptonian. So he can assimilate and assert himself at will, which is the ultimate fantasy of immigrants.
Mhm.
Again, certainly in the 1930s. Um, Now, Siegel wrote a memoir that was never published and got lost and was found pretty recently, which is a bit of a treasure trove. It was found in 2011 by Larry Ty, who was a wonderful pop culture historian. And in it, he acknowledges that he was heavily influenced by Samson, who, if you remember, had super strength. He also had super speed, if you go back and read the story. He could leap long distances in a single bound. And don't forget, he was an Israelite judge. He fought in the name of truth and justice. And Siga acknowledges Samson was significant influence, and in fact, in the early comics, Superman is compared to Samson regularly. And the cover of Superman #4 from 1940 is a deliberate homage to Samson. You see Superman toppling pillars. Um, Siegel was also heavily inspired by the Golem of Prague, the famous Jewish legends, like a Frankenstein, Jewish Frankenstein. particularly a 1920 German movie called Der Golem, in creating an indestructible, indefatigable champion of the oppressed. That was his inspiration. And the Moses metaphor, even though Siegel never acknowledged it explicitly, never talks about that, I think is the easiest thing to point to. Superman's origin story is that to save the baby, they put him in a small vessel and they send him adrift to an unknown fate. He is found amidst the amber waves of grain of a Kansas field by people not his own. He's renamed by his mother. He grows up not knowing where he comes from. At 18, he crosses the North Pole, right? There's the Fortress of Solitude and the hologram of Jor-El, and he returns to his people as a great miracle working savior. What's the origin of Moses? Baby, saved his life, small vessel, sent adrift, found in vegetation, raised, renamed by the mother, doesn't know, crosses the desert, sees a burning bush. It's analogous, right? It's metaphorically analogous. It goes back to the adopted people in this case. That's where the metaphor splits as a great miracle working savior. It's the same origin story, beat per beat, practically. And you touched on World War II. These were all things that they sort of borrowed, the Lego bricks that they borrowed to build their Superman. Not only, but also, but the impetus for creating Superman, and Siegel and Schuster both discussed this in interviews later on, was the persecution of Jews in Europe, the rising anti-Semitism in America, which, believe it or not, was even worse than today, and the need to fight back in any way they could, which in their case, to teenage kids, was through their fiction. And indeed, Superman fought the Nazis in his comics almost 2 years before Pearl Harbor. The first time he fights the comics is on February 27th, 1940, in a story, two-page story called How Superman Would End the War. And at that time, 93% of Americans were against intervention, were against accepting any Jewish refugees. And in fact, that story got them death threats from the German American Bund, not that it stopped them. So all that is part of the stew that ended up creating Superman.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. I think one of the cool things you bring up is the fact that you make a character like this and the stuff that you're just raised in and a part of just becomes part of the your tools and your influence in telling a story that is interesting to you. Again, I write a lot about a lot of religious art, particularly Christian, like faith-based films. And one of the frustrations that I often have with what they do is they come in with a very clear agenda, where it's like, okay, here's the message that I want people to get from it, rather than just naturally pulling from what interests them within the way they're raised, what they think is beautiful, what they think is interesting. And I think it's really cool that, and a lot of Jewish Americans did this. You mentioned White Christmas. One of the things they were very good at was making stories that pulled very explicitly from Jewish heritage, but make it palatable to mainstream audiences so that everyone was like, oh yeah, I can own this as mine and take this on as mine as well. And that's a really fascinating thing. Another thing I think you point out that's really noteworthy is the fact that they were pulling from specifically the Bible and Jewish heroes about what a strong man should be like, I think is really interesting in terms of shaping how pop culture will view the kind of the strong hero going forward. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But, there are other strong character archetypes within the culture at the time that people pulled from. For example, you had the Greek gods who were strong and powerful, but were not fighting on the side of the oppressed. And then you had but also a lot of stories at the time that were about strong people that were monsters and villains. And in fact, one of the things when I first went back and read the early Superman comics, I remember one of the things that kept being brought up over and over again was how lucky we all are that he's fighting on the side of justice. And that was took me back to that mentality because I was like, well, I'm just so used to the superhero genre. It's not a surprise that there are these super powerful characters fighting on the side of good. But for them, that was much less common to have those kinds of characters within the pop culture at the time. So the characters themselves would comment on it. Now, one of the things that you brought up since you brought it up, I want to touch on is the fact that so many people today associate Superman with Christian allegory. And that's, because, I mean, he's he said his origins are, it's not hiding the ball. He was created by two Jewish boys, and there is such very explicit Jewish metaphors and analogies in there. But at a certain point, as other creators kind of got involved in Superman, a lot more of the analogies more explicitly became tied to Christianity and Jesus. Superman the movie was a big part of that, I believe. But I want to kind of get your take on this. First of all, I'll try not to fit in six questions into this one question this time. But firstly, when about did that seem to happen, if you know? Why do you think it happened? And does that fundamentally change the Superman character in some way when it starts being more of a Christian metaphor than a Jewish one?
That's another home run question there. So let me rewind a little bit, and I'll try to cover everything, but be succinct. The first story ever told is a superhero story. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which the ancient Sumerian cuneiform, right? It's etched in. It dates back to at least 2300 BCE. That's old. It's the oldest story we know about of any kind, and it's about a guy with superpowers, super strength, leaping, super speed, the whole thing. He's one third god. I don't know how that works, but that's the thing. Um, by the way, that's also where Lilith, the legend of Lilith, comes from. Um, and he goes on adventures for glory, for everlasting life, to become a god. Familiar, you know. And there's even a cliche where the other gods are afraid that he would become a god and then best them. So they create a superpowered wild man called Enkidu, and they send him down to Earth to fight Gilgamesh. So they meet, they fight, realize that they have a lot more in common, and then team up to take down the other gods. It's all in there in the first story ever told, which I think is hilarious, if you're just willing to look at it that way. But from Gilgamesh, and you look, of course, superheroes have been compared to, and in many ways based on the Greco-Roman pantheons. Fine. And if you look at Beowulf and you look at other, characters of legend, what they all have in common is powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. But what they don't have is the desire to fight a never-ending battle for truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. That concept of a leader as a servant, of a morality, of a deity morality that's equal to a human morality, that they're the same thing, that good is good, and that a god isn't entitled to do whatever the god wants just because by virtue of being a god. That traces back to the Hebrew Bible. That's where that starts. And then it develops, of course, the New Testament, etc. But it starts there. So on the surface of it, Superman is Helios, the sun god, and the Flash is Hermes, and all that stuff. Fine. But the idea of somebody dedicating themselves to protecting the innocent, the weak, that's a very Judeo-Christian concept. That's where that value comes from. So it's like a mish. And again, there's room for everybody. I just want to trace where every idea comes from, right? In my book, I do trace when did Superman become Christianized, and this isn't to take away from that. He's equally that too. There's again room for everybody, but we want to know how these ideas came about. Um, Wrote a few articles about it if you Google them, and it really does. The watershed really is 1978's Superman, the movie. Until then, in the comics, there really isn't much. There aren't any. Jesus is not brought up. There aren't any Christian metaphors. There aren't any cross allegories. He's not sent to Earth by a father to save us from ourselves. It's not a mission from the heavens. It's a poor refugee who got shuttled off before like the Kinder transport. If you're familiar with the concept, that's what he is. Um, but of course, he's a great savior from the heavens, and there's always that. It really started developing in Superman the movie, where they very consciously and deliberately brought in a Christological underpinning. But one of the things that made that movie work so well versus, let's say, Man of Steel in 2013 and Batman v Superman in 2016 is that there it was a cultural blueprint, not an attempt to evangelize. Whereas in the latter two movies, they hit you over the head with a jackhammer, and it just becomes, you feel like you're force fed. And when you feel like you're force fed, you don't want to eat. There's a balance. The story has to be in front of the metaphor always. Otherwise, it's a sermon, and we didn't sign up for a sermon. We want to see a Superman movie. It's that simple. So it really starts in the 70s. and reaches its peak in the 90s. In 1992, 1994, there was a storyline called The Death and Return of Superman. That's pretty Jesus-y. And in it, he sacrifices his life to save us, although it's not our sins, it's Krypton sins, long story. He dies, his sepulcher is found empty. He returns, not before there are false prophets, and one of them, of course, is basically the devil, big villain. So it very much, but again, this borrowed is a blueprint. And of course, in the movies, you see him in a cross figure here and there, and I even have like a side by side in my book. Yeah,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I remember them talking in the Superman movie how they were trying to consciously take the Superman character and sort of explain to Americans who didn't read comic books why this matters to you, why he matters to our culture, and why, and not explain in a didactic way, like you said, but build in from the cultural consciousness why this should feel profound and important. And that, so there was that say, oh yeah, like Jesus Christ, that makes sense. And I agree with you. I think you can, when we're talking about emphasizing Superman's Jewish roots, we can sound like we're saying, okay, Superman is not for everybody. He's just for a certain people, and that's not
right.
obviously what we're saying. Like, obviously, I'm not Jewish. I'm a Christian. I love Superman. He's one of my favorite characters, and I think the fact is, Jewish and Christian faiths are very tied together as well. I mean, even if you want to say, yeah, your Christianity starts with the Hebrew Bible also. So there is a necessary, there is a fittingness of like, okay, yeah, we are, if we are trying to make any Christ analogies with Superman as we're developing more aspects of his character, obviously it's going to fit very well with the base of Superman's Jewish identity and Jewish roots. I mean, again, the Christian, I mean, again, if it is, there is a Christian idea of a powerful person who's the savior of the oppressed. That's because he came from Judaism, and I think there's a fittingness about that. There's also fittingness about the fact that, yeah, in the immigrant story, there was assimilation that went on, and so I think there's a fittingness that as a character, Superman has sort of been assimilated in the other writers and artists who have done these things with him. But it's still worth noting the fact that, just like far too many people way too early on tried to separate Christianity uh, from Judaism uh, all the time, and kind of as an excuse for anti-Semitism, there is real value in reminding us, well, no, the Superman's roots are still Jewish. Even if you want to do the Christ-like stuff, that's great, but the roots are still there. And I think that that's really fascinating. Now, the Jewish identity. Oh, sorry, you go ahead before I move on.
No, all good. Listen, because this is religion unplugged, and we're gonna talk a bit more intelligently about the religious facets of things. It's worth noting, Jesus was Jewish. He was born in ancient Israel.
Yeah, shocking.
Um, when he practiced religiously, he spoke Hebrew, and in the street, coined Greek or Aramaic. He was a rabbi. He was a descendant of King David. It's all good. It's all. Christians weren't considered a separate religion till what was it, like almost 400 years after the fact, 370
Yeah.
whatever. Okay, so it all
No,
fits.
I was all saying, I'm going to jump in here. If you look at the early New Testament works, a lot of their arguments were saying, no, we have the correct interpretation of Judaism, and
Right,
regardless of whether you agree with that or not, they were making the argument for their own Jewishness of
right,
their
right. The true
beliefs.
Jews. Right. Now we have a new prophet and a new covenant, and everybody else is
Exactly.
on
Yeah.
board. Right, we're continuing a straight path. They split off. That's the view, and
Right.
perfectly fine. But as you said, it doesn't matter because the issue here is more ethnic and cultural than religious. And either way, it's a matter of recognizing contribution, not kind of claiming ownership. That doesn't make any sense. You listen, you don't need to be black to enjoy jazz. You don't need to be Asian to enjoy, an egg roll. Nothing works that way. But it's fun to recognize how things came to be the way they are. Every idea comes from somewhere. That's the fun of it.
Yeah, and it does give us a recognition of gratitude of the people and the ideas and where they come from. Now, to that complexity, I want to tie into David Corenswet, who's the new Superman. And you wrote an article about the fact that people were kind of excited by the fact that he was the first, it's seemingly the first Jewish actor to play Superman in at least in one of the big live action films. And which is a big deal considering, again, all that we've talked about of his very Jewish roots. So now I want, but you address in the article that this brings up a lot of the complex issues of Jewish cultural identity because, David Koretz's when it's half Jewish and it's from his father's side, but then in general, it also doesn't seem to be exactly practicing. And this, or at least we're not aware of it. And this brings up some of the interesting aspects of Jewish cultural identity. Ryan Burge has done a recent book on the American religious landscape that I read, where he goes into, how we categorize religious groups is very like complicated, because there's belief, what was it, belief, belonging, and practice. And for like, a lot of Christian groups, that's a little bit easier to kind of like map out. It's like, okay, do you believe the doctrines? Do you consider yourself belonging to the group? And do you go to church, every Sunday? Like you can kind of say, but with certain other, religious groups, it's a little bit more complicated because with Jews, it's like, it's, cultural and it's also to some degree ethnic in different ways and it's religious. And so those answers can be a little bit interesting. So would you kind of touch on that a little bit in regarding the David Corn Sweat actor, but then also this issue in general for people who are like just less aware of these religious complexities of a Jewish identity?
No, I'm very excited to answer it because there's not a lot of places where I can go into detail and the audience would actually be interested, and this is one of them. So I'm very excited. Um, so regarding corn sweat, I'm not sure how much Jewish self-definition he has. I don't know if he goes around saying I'm Jewish. I don't know. I don't know the guy. I can tell you this: he is Jewish on his father's side, and in traditional Judaism, it goes on the mother's side. It's matrilineal heritage. So that's one. So from the Orthodox perspective, that's a question mark. There are different streams in Judaism, and the more reform, more secularized streams, denominations, it doesn't matter. I know he was bar mitzvahed, and I know that when he got married, he's married as a child, the wedding was co-officiated by his father's rabbi. He's from Philadelphia, the family's from New Orleans, by his father's rabbi from New Orleans, and by a Catholic priest on his. So clearly there's some Jewish element to his identity, but I don't know how much. It doesn't matter. We're happy that there's representation, right? And that's nice. In a way, it's coming back full circle. So it's nice. Is it important beyond that? Of course not. It's just a nice thing to acknowledge. Regarding Jewish identity, when Wonder Woman came out in 2017, uh, which is worthy of a Religion Unplugged episode of itself, if it's hasn't received one, there was a flurry of articles whether Gal Gadot, the Israeli actress who played her, is considered a person of color. Um, I was born and raised in Israel, in Tel Aviv, where I'd always considered myself Western, but not white. If there's white and there's brown, we're khaki. We're so in between. But we're not considered white from a racial perspective. If we take the Holocaust, just an example everybody knows, the benchmark wasn't whether or not you attended shul. The benchmark was whether or not two or more of your grandparents were Jewish. It was race based. My grandparents were in the camps or survived the camps based on the race, not the religiosity. They were completely secular. Um, but in America, race is understood almost exclusively in terms of skin color. But that's a very modern and very American, not even Western, American understanding. And Jewish identity is very ancient and it's much more complicated. So there's ethnic, there's racial, religious, cultural facets. And this brings us to the Bible. This is Religion Unplugged. the first and the first one is Abraham, right? He's the progenitor. He's not Jewish and he's not an Israel. He's not an Israel. He's a Hebrew. He's only referred to as a Hebrew. And the Hebrews are talked about as a peoplehood, which back then was both a race and ethnicity and a nation. It was tribal. So it was a tribal mentality. That was thousands of years ago. And then it continues. Abraham is a Hebrew. Isaac is a Hebrew. Jacob is a Hebrew. Jacob changed his name to Israel. His children are known as Hebrews and Israelites. the children of Israel. That's where that name comes from. Then we go, there's Joseph, Egypt, slavery, you know the story. But and the Bible refers to the people in those chapters, which is half of the Bible, is Hebrews or Israelites. That's it. There's no Jews. There's no religion. They believe in the monotheistic God, but there's no even codified ritual. Nothing. Then they leave and they go to the desert, right? There's a whole water thing. You've heard of it. And then there's Mount Sinai. Moses goes up, he comes down with 3 tablets with 10 commandments, and in the Torah, in Jewish tradition, that's when the Bible was also dictated. Then and only then is there a religion. That's when Judaism shows up. That's more than 2/3 into the book, right? And the name doesn't even become, the word Jewish isn't even coined until they go into Canaan and they settle it and they name it Israel, and they start distributing areas, and it becomes the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judea, based on the tribe of Judea. That's where the word Jew comes from. So that's so much later. So even in the religious doctrine, even in the religious texts that form Judaism, the religion is the last thing. First, it's a peoplehood and ethnicity. Then it's a culture, and only then it's a religion. So to your point, if you now say, I renounce Christ, I do not believe in Christ, then you're not a Christian. And if you say, I now accept the teachings of Buddha, then you're a Buddhist, right? If you're Jewish, you can say, I renounce Judaism and I'm not going to practice Buddhism. And your mom will say, yeah, that's nice. Are you coming for Seder? It's just a different concept of what that is.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And that's really helpful for a lot of people because, again, a lot of these, religion markers of talking about religion are not wrongly, but just you have to understand it, coming from a largely Christian context of like how you categorize these things. And so it's not always going to map perfectly onto every different group. And so, but you just have to understand these things to know how complicated it is to have these discussions and not have these discussions in an unintelligent way. So I'm really thankful. That was a great breakdown for people. Now, one of the things I want to talk about before we, start to wrap up is this is we talk about the Jewish roots of Superman. You can see that the blueprint of Superman is the blueprint of all sort of superheroes. Just the idea of somebody with power fighting on behalf of the little guy is what they've all based on. But the the Jewish influence has gone into all superheroes as well, not just because of that. I mean, Stan Lee was Jewish as well, and he created like 80% of the superheroes that we all know and love today. And so, and this I think goes into your documentary, the Juice documentary. What would, can you give a little bit of an idea for people, just kind of a snapshot of how this influence also kind of permeated and developed in the superhero genre as a whole?
Yeah. Another good one. So Superman is the first superhero. It's like any other evolutionary tree. You can point to earlier things, but all the tropes that make a superhero start with Superman. He's the alpha and the omega, the thesis to which every other character is an antithesis or an homage or whatever. Um, and the comic book industry, throughout most of its history, certainly in 20th century until late in the 20th century, for the first 50 or so years of its existence, was almost exclusively Jewish. And what I note in my book, and I think it's funny, is that of the few that weren't Jewish, the vast majority were Italian, and they were the artists, where the Jews were the writers. And it just seems so in the cultural tradition of most people, you know? Um, but also because they grew up together in Brooklyn and the Lower East Side, in the Bronx. That's just, a lot of it's that simple. Stanley, as you noted, was born Stanley Martin Lieber. And although he started in 1939, he really uh, had his kind of prolific, this explosion of creativity in what was called the Marvel Age or the Marvel Revolution from 1961 to 1966. And in those 5 years, he created nothing alone. Uh, he co-created with other creators, particularly Jack Kirby, born Jacob Kurtzberg, metaphorically, maybe the biggest Jewish metaphor maker in comics ever, and we'll circle back to him. They created um, Fantastic Four, Hulk, the Avengers, the X-Men, Spider-Man. Spider-Man was Steve Ditko, but Jack Kirby was involved. Daredevil, Black Panther, Silver Surfer, Thor, Iron Man, every Marvel character pretty much came from those 5 years. Explosion, that's the Big Bang, right? Um, and they all have Jewish, well, most of them have Jewish signification to one extent or another. And it's very much the Jewish signification of they're the second generation of heroes, and it's the second generation of Jews. At that point, Lee and his cohorts were middle-aged. The kids reading it were, and it's very much the new anxieties of a new generation reflected. And you see it in Peter Parker, you see it in the X-Men, you see it in the Fantastic Four. I'll give you the easiest example for the audience at home is the Fantastic Four has the Thing, right? The Thing was based on Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby had a thick brow. He chomped cigars. He sounded like James Cagney. The Thing, like Jack Kirby, was raised on the Lower East Side. He's on Yancey Street, which is nicknamed for Delancey Street, Kirby's corner street. He was in a youth gang in the Lower East Side, just like Kirby. He had rooftop fights, just like Kirby. He enlisted, just like Kirby. He was a gruff with a heart of gold, just like Kirby. I interviewed Kirby's son, who absolutely acknowledged that they're the one and the same. And the civilian identity of the Thing is Benjamin Jacob Grimm, Benjamin being Jack's father and Jacob being Jack. So he really based that on himself. In terms of metaphor, if we have time, we can go into that. But these characters are very, very rich in uh, Jewish signification.
Yeah, I think, touching off of that, we'll do a little bit of it more just so people get a bit of a taste. You can tell me how off base I am here and use it as a springboard.
Yeah,
But you talk about the second generation cultural anxieties, which I think are fascinating. And one of the things I can already see if I look at it from that lens is you take characters like Superman, and they really are this, like you said, if they are this idea of how do I find the balance of my, my assimilated identity and my heritage identity in an era where I have to assimilate. A lot of the characters in Stan Lee's are like, well, what do I do if I can't? What about all the rest of us that can't or won't in some way? Because again, the Fantastic Four don't have secret identities. The X-Men also, again, are dealing with these racial ideas and racial tensions of, like, yeah, sure. I mean, some of us are, can pass, but not all of us can. Some of us are more, stereotypically, identifiable than others, or some of us just choose not to, don't want to be, hide our light under a bushel, so to speak. What do we do about that? And so that is an interesting aspect of this. Is that a kind of a direction you think is a good analysis of how some of that went
100%.
down?
100%. Stan Lee even said that Spider-Man is basically Woody Allen in tights. And Woody Allen is very much an embodiment of the Jewish anxieties of his generation. He's a caricature of them embodied in a person. That's his shtick, but so is Peter Parker. And Peter Parker in the comics, if you don't know, speaks in Yiddish nonstop, sprinkles Yiddishism. Let's kibitz, my tuchus hurts. He says so many ois, it might as well be his catchphrase. He complains that he's tired from Shavuos. Even in New York, Gentiles don't speak Yiddish that much. It's just, it's very clear. Um, and I always point out jokingly that Spider-Man's powers are to climb things and swing from things, which means he really doesn't have much to do outside of Manhattan, right? And talk about a Jewish metaphor right there. It's, but you look at the X-Men that you brought up. It's a group of people who aren't. It's not a Fantastic Four who got their powers. They're mutants. They're born that way. They have the gifts of their heritage that are also the curse of their heritage and the burden of their heritage. Some of them can pass and they choose to. Some of them can't. Some of them choose not to. But they're a different race. And even though they want to do good, they are feared and mistrusted and hated by the whole world. And in order to hide from that world, they all live in a private school in New York. That's basically a yeshiva with their leader isn't a guy who goes in the field. It's Xavier. He sits in a wheelchair and teaches them. That's their rabbi. And they go into the world and they do good deeds in hopes that that would change people's minds about mutants, about what they are. And the biggest enemies aren't actually people who hate mutants. It's mutants like them who've had enough of the persecution and want to fight back. It's Magneto, who's a Holocaust survivor, a camp survivor who's had enough. And I recently interviewed Chris Claremont, who, after Lee, and I would argue more than Lee, was the most influential creator of the X-Men. Um, we filmed it. It's going to be a PBS special coming out in the next couple of months at some point. Yeah, I'm excited. Um, in which he discusses how he actually based Xavier on David Ben Gurion and the first Prime Minister of Israel, and Magneto on Menachem Begin, the sixth Prime Minister of Israel, who was a resistance fighter during the British occupation and went from very hawkish to very dovish and eventually signed the first peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. So he really based them on these two archetypes intentionally, which I think is fascinating. So it's all
Oh,
there. It's all
absolutely.
there. Yeah.
That's really, really cool and really fascinating. So, as we're wrapping things up, and again, like I said, this is not to say, again, obviously, everybody loves the X-Men, everybody loves the Fantastic Four, everybody has, um, can see themselves in these characters. But I think it's really one of the things I've been very impressed with about the Jewish communities in America and elsewhere is how good they have been at telling stories that are very distinctively of their own culture while making it something for everyone and changing our culture for the better because of it. I think the world is a better place because our standard of what a strong person ought to be is also a good person. That's,
Thank you. I agree.
um, but I would say then, if to wrap things up, why you have dedicated a lot of your life and your career to showing the connection between Jewish culture and heritage and pop culture, and particularly superheroes and like Superman. What, and we talked a little bit about the reasons why, but if you could just sum up why you think that that's an important thing to do for us to recognize and for us to unpack the way we have today, what would you say? And what would be the one thing that you'd want to leave people with that we haven't discussed yet in this episode?
Well, the thing I want to leave people with, and I'm going to channel Stan Lee here, is buy my book. It's great. You're not gonna
That's a good one.
the
Yeah.
holidays. Yeah, exactly. It's sold everywhere. Fine books are sold. But in seriousness, why is it important? I would start with the argument that it's not really important. Go enjoy your Marvel movie. Who cares? But past that, right? It makes the experience of enjoying these things, whether it's a comic book, whether it's a video game, whether it's a movie, that much richer. You know the context, you know the origination of different ideas and different aspects. It allows you to enjoy them more. And beyond that, um, I'm a big, big believer in the American ethos. We are a people based around an idea, around a set of values. We don't have thousands of years going back, a shared border or shared ethnicity or shared history. None of that. What makes us Americans is what we believe in. And I would argue, as schmaltzy as it sounds, as cheesy as it sounds, is that belief at its core is each other, is that we do everything together, that we are unified and have the strength of unification. And in that, recognizing what each brings to the table, what each contributes to the stew, what each the benefits. Yes, Superman would not be Superman if he wasn't raised by heartland American values, truth, just the American way. But he also wouldn't be Superman if he didn't bring the gifts of his Kryptonian heritage from elsewhere. You need both. And that is the promise. And it's one that I really buy into. And I think that's why it's important to recognize these things.
That's so great. I really love that. What makes America great is that there is a conversation that's going on from different people from different points of view, and that conversation, whether it's arguments or whether it's let me put our art together, it can all come to the surface, and then we can all say, ah, yeah, that's actually more beautiful. I like that. I like that idea. I like that character. And, the reason we can have the kinds of hero stories that are so beloved around the world today is because we had Superman. And it's because of two, you know, people with very particular experiences that brought that to the table. And like you said, if we know that's how that happened, we can keep doing that. We can keep allowing the next person to be a part of the conversation, that we can say, okay, let's see what they bring to the table. And we'll reject some of it and then we'll accept other things, but we won't try to prevent the conversation from people who might be different and might be a different voice from happening. And that's really inspiring to me. And that's why I really enjoy what you do. So Okay, you hawked your book just a few moments ago, but tell me of the book, the documentary, the new PBS special, all the things you want people to know where they can reach, see more of your work. What are those, and where can they get them?
The PBS special is going to be called Comics Culture, an exciting conversation with Chris Claremont. I'm not sure when it comes up, but they said before September, so sometime soon. Um, and that's one that I produced, so that's a lot of fun. There's going to be a half-hour version on TV and a full-hour version on YouTube. My book is Superman Circumcised, the complete Jewish history of the world's greatest hero, which you by no means need to be Jewish to enjoy. It's sold everywhere books are sold. If the store doesn't have a copy, they can order it easily. Amazon is probably cheapest. The documentary, which is a half-hour documentary, it's a TV special, can be found on the JLTV website. But if you follow me on social media, the link is pinned at the top of all my social media. You can just watch it online for free. So at Real Roy Schwartz on X, Instagram, Facebook, it's all the same. Don't fall for the fake Roy Schwartz. It's Real Roy Schwartz and RoySchwartz.com.
No counterfeits, only the authentic Roy Schwartz
Okay,
we
yeah.
want here. Well, thank you so much, Roy, for joining us. This is fantastic. And thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed it half as much as I did. And remember, this is Religion Unplugged, your one stop shop for all the best religious news and culture.